I just want to say how much I'm grateful for Lee for being here, for Elise and her leadership on this topic and others, and my friend from Florida, Brian Mast, for his service in our United States military, but also with the Israeli Defense Forces, as Lee pointed out. You've got a wealth of knowledge and experience here, people who believe in and care in Israel. But all we're getting from the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue are a bunch of words. We're not seeing any action, as my friend Lee pointed out. We need to be clear, and we're all here today, right here, to stand here to say that we're clear that Israel not only has a right to defend itself, but it has an obligation, a duty to defend itself. And we have a duty in our country to stand alongside our friend Israel, stand alongside our ally. The Biden administration often uses this word now, Israel has a right to defend itself, but that's empty if it's not backed up by actions in our country. We want to see action. First, stop talking about a ceasefire, implying an equal fault between Israel and Hamas, a known terrorist organization. A ceasefire isn't a strategy. A strategy is to focus on the source of the conflict, which is Hamas and its puppet masters in Tehran. We need to be honest about this. Second, we should defer to Israel to determine what is necessary to protect its citizens and deliver a decisive blow to Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. In other words, we should encourage the killing of terrorists, not negotiate with them. Third, we must make clear our commitment to support any Israeli request for resupply of precision-guided munitions and expedite any pending sales or transfers that might be of assistance, instead of equivocating. The President should not be listening to the musings of our House colleagues that are effectively in the Hamas squad. And that's what we see here in the House of Representatives. Fourth, the Biden administration should stop negotiating with Iran and reject the so-called deal, providing billions of dollars to an Iranian regime that then takes those dollars and supports entities like Hamas that are then targeting Israel and undermining our national security in the process. Fifth, while radical elements of the Democratic Party lament that Israel's Iron Dome is disproportionately saving lives in the face of over 3,000 rockets being fired from Gaza, Israel should be commended for its unprecedented efforts in warfare to take every effort possible to minimize, to target terrorist targets and to give warning to time to minimize civilian casualties. Think about that. I mean, Israel calls ahead and says, hey, incoming, in order to try to minimize civilian casualties. All of this in the face of 3,000 rockets blasting in Israel. And by the way, an enormous number of those, upwards of a tenth or 1/7 of them, actually falling short and hitting Palestinians. This is just another reason why we're calling on President Biden to be crystal clear in his actions, that we stand with the Prime Minister of Israel, the people of Israel, and the nation of Israel. Look, peace is only going to be achieved when terrorist groups like Hamas back down, we've defeated them, and we have full recognition and respect of Israel, and stop firing rockets not only on Israel, but on the Palestinian people, as we said. We need the President of the United States to represent the people of the United States. And the people of the United States stand with Israel. And it's time that the President reflect that will. With that, my colleagues want to say anything? Brady?
Well, thank you, Chip. I'm glad to be here. I hadn't heard that from Hamas squad. I've heard the squad. I've been calling them the Hamas squad. It's unbelievable that they would work for Americans, get elected by Americans, and not have American values. Unbelievable. But we are glad that President Biden is very busy. I'm told he has a rough schedule. He gets started around 9 a.m. and winds down at 6 p.m. so he can go to bed. I'm glad he's finally woke. Now, I'm not saying he's part of the woke group. I misunderstand that, but I'm glad he's finally woke up. After how many rockets? 3,500 rockets. How many rockets, Mr. President, would have to come across our border in the United States from our southern neighbor, our northern neighbor, off some ship on either coast? How many rockets would we have to take incoming before we would do something about it? You better believe Israel has the right to defend themselves. For him to call for a ceasefire, where was he when the first 1 or 2 rockets landed in Israel or toward Israel from Hamas? Where was he calling for a ceasefire back then? For the last 4 years under Trump, the relationship between Israel and Palestinians have been relatively calm. Now we see the recent attacks on Hamas. I think somebody said every time we get a new president, our enemies test him. Let me just tell you something. Biden gets a failing grade. He gets a failing grade. You might ask, in the first 4 months, this is happening. You might ask, what's changed in the first 4 months? Well, I'll tell you what hasn't. Some say that this has to do with the eviction of some Palestinians from 4 houses out of East Jerusalem. No, it's because they didn't pay their rent. Has nothing to do with their ethnicity or their religious preferences. Number 2, on April the 7th, President Biden announced the restoration of hundreds of million dollars to the Palestinian terrorist organization. What does he think they're going to do with that money? Does he really think they're going to build houses? They're going to put it in health care, build schools? No, they're going to put it in fighting Israel, sending in more rockets. Additionally, in February, President Biden removed the Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen's terrorist designation. How bad does somebody have to be to have a terrorist designation? They're killing people. They're terrorists, for Pete's sake. They strap dynamite on the chest of even young boys and send them in to kill people. And Biden removed their terrorist designation. Way to go, President Biden. These moves only serve to encourage Hamas. Unbelievable. As we know, Hamas is a terrorist organization that we would equate to ISIS or ISIL. Remember them? That's Hamas. That's Hamas. When Hamas, who behaves similarly to the Houthis, sees the U.S. remove the Houthis' terrorist designation with no requirements for straightening their act up. I mean, you know, like quit killing people. There's a novel thought. Straightening their act. They see the administration's mass funding cuts added back to the Palestinians. What do you think Hamas is going to say? There's a new sheriff in town or a new president. And then they're going to do anything they want. You've seen that in the first 4 months. Remember, Israel is a democracy. Israel is our greatest ally, as someone said earlier. Israel is what's keeping the powder keg over in the Middle East stable, somewhat stable. We must support Israel at all costs, period, bar none. They have the right to defend themselves. I just can't believe that they have as much restraint as they do. My gosh, I'm from Texas. If we were getting rockets from across the southern border, you've got to believe our great Texas DPS and our fighters there would be across that border within a matter of hours, if not minutes. Israel has the right to defend themselves. Biden's both sides de-escalation language, as he calls it, only fuels the violence coming from Hamas. It's just that simple. Did anyone call for de-escalation during the United States response to Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan after September 11th? Did anybody call for de-escalation? No, because we went after terrorists, we went after the enemies, and we demanded that they pay a price. And our great military, our great fighting men and women made them pay that price. I could go on and on and on. Hamas has a history of, and is currently hiding and fighting rockets. They hide behind houses. They put their base under a hospital, their headquarters. They hide behind women and children. They send rockets into Israel to kill women and children, and then they want to use women and children as their deflectors and their shields. People, it's high time that this stop. If the Biden administration actually cared about the loss of life in Gaza and Israel, including the death of many children, many women, innocent civilians, then their policy positions should reflect that. Biden's policies actually perpetuate the poor, the stateless, and the oppressed condition Palestinians find themselves in. Biden should step up to the plate and take leadership like President Trump did. When President Trump was in office, you didn't see this. There was a reason. We had a strong president. Hamas doesn't want peace. Their only goal is the absolute destruction of Israel. They're backed by Iran, whose goal is not only the destruction of Israel, but who? Oh yeah, the United States of America. And we expect them to play fair with a ceasefire. Come on, President Biden, wake up. You may even have to work longer hours than 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. I'm sorry. We must never forget whoever is in the White House. Israel is our greatest ally. Americans' policy should honor that relationship, not embolden Israel's mortal enemies, for Pete's sake. To prevent more Israeli and Palestinian deaths, President Biden needs to wake up, stop reversing successful policy, strict on the basis of what appears to be their hatred for Trump. Anything Trump stood for, they're against. Can you believe that? It's going to cost Israel lives, Palestinians lives, Hamas lives. It's just unbelievable. If he would not have such a hatred for Trump and would actually restore that policy, we could restore peace to the Middle East. I'm proud to stand with the state of Israel, defend the state of Israel. I can't tell you how important it is. I I'm proud to be here. I want to thank Chip for putting it on. Yeah, more than enough to come on up this time.
Just a few months ago, we had peace in the Middle East. As a matter of fact, we had peace all over the world because President Trump led with strength. He made wonderful deals. He worked with many nations to bring peace to the Middle East. Now we are falling apart and destabilizing faster than anyone could imagine. This is weak leadership. This is leadership that's being pushed around. President Joe Biden is being pushed around by the Jihad Squad. These are members of Congress that are supporting terrorists, Hamas terrorists that are bombing Israel. Israel is our ally. I'm proud to stand here with my colleagues in support of Israel. They have the right to defend themselves from terrorists who are trying to kill them and take their land. Iran sends an average of $30 million to Hamas every single month. This administration and Democrat members of Congress want to re-enter a deal with Iran that would provide much more funding for terror and be detrimental to the United States. See, the problem is when we have members of Congress that are supporting not only terrorist Hamas abroad, but they're also supporting domestic terrorists, Antifa, BLM, right here at home, that have attacked American cities, American businesses, police officers, federal buildings, monuments, and taken over cities like in Portland. We have a serious problem. United States members of Congress should not support terrorism at home or abroad. This is a call to Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Cori Bush, and others who call themselves the Squad, but they're now known as the Jihad Squad, to stop supporting and defending terrorists. This is against who we are as America. We have to stand strong with our ally Israel, and we have to stand up for their right to defend themselves. At this time, I'd like to hand over this to the good congressman from Pennsylvania, General Scott Perry.
Thank you all. I'm very pleased to stand shoulder to shoulder with my colleagues and stand up for our ally and friend Israel. Look around. What do you see? More importantly, what don't you see? Not one Democrat here. We have a lot of disagreements and things that we have different opinions on in Congress and in America. But this shouldn't be one of them. This should not be one of them. Hamas is a terrorist organization supported by Iran, who calls the United States of America the Great Satan. Hamas's charter calls for the murder and the killing of Jews. It says that that's their duty, to kill Jews. Members of Congress are supporting that. They are supporting the killing, the murder of Jews. We said never again. Once in this country's history, we said never again. People in this building, people that serve the American people, are supporting the murder of Jews, anti-Semitism. That has to be clear. There's a difference between Republicans and Democrats. They should be here. There shouldn't be any equivocation. This shouldn't be a discussion. For President Biden, it shouldn't take courage. It's obvious. Iran is the enemy of the United States of America. They stand for the killing of the Jewish people. There should be no discussion. We shouldn't have to stand here. It's absurd. I support Israel. I support my colleagues who support Israel. I call on you to say, what happened to the Democrat Party? Where is it? The Democrat Party that used to stand lockstep in support with Israel, our ally with Republicans, is gone. Quit acting like it's still here. It's gone.
I'm going to turn this over to Elise to close this out, but I just want to share with the press. I mean, this just broke the Times of Israel, that Prime Minister Netanyahu says that a drone shot down earlier this week was Iranian UAV armed with explosives. This is what's going on. This is the truth of what's happening in Israel. I'm going to turn it over to our chair, Elise.
Thank you so much, and thank you again to Chip Roy for organizing this event today. This question needs to be asked of every Democrat serving in Congress. Do they stand with Israel, or do they stand with the terrorist organization of Hamas? That should be an easy answer for every single person elected to serve in this body. It is clearly not for many Democrats. This is a crystal clear choice for the American people. The American people, despite Ilhan Omar, despite AOC, despite Rashida Tlaib, the American people proudly stand with Israel. And we are going to keep talking about this issue to make sure that citizens across this country understand this is a clear difference between the Republican Party and the far left socialist Democrats of today. So thank you very much for my colleagues for coming today. And they're calling votes soon. So thank you very much.